Okay. Oh. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Pujitha. In case you don't know me, I'm a first year, I'm a newbie, and I'm planning to double major in data science and sociology. So this was kind of inspired because I'm taking a class right now called Data 483, which is data and justice. It's like a relatively new class, but I would highly recommend taking it. I think everyone who's doing data science needs to take it. But I'm going to share some of my insights from that class, as well as some of my own thoughts. I didn't really know what to call this, but it's going to be about data, system, society, and us. It's very vague, but we'll hopefully figure out what that means in a little bit. Okay. So we all know about big tech, and they kind of have this narrative right now that they're perpetuating, and there's like two key components to this narrative, right? First is probably something that everyone has heard, like everyone and their mom is talking about AI everywhere. You know, like it's in our everyday discussions. It's like the hot topic right now. We're talking about it like in DSS. Our professors are talking about it. Our friends are talking about it. Like we're all talking about like ChatGPT. And specifically by big tech, it's kind of like promoted as this thing that's going to like solve all of our problems and transform society, which it is the latter half. And the second thing that is perpetuated in this narrative is that AI has bias. So, and that's specifically by big tech. So I think like that's something that was interesting. And by the way, this is kind of off of this Medium article, which I linked here. So if anyone's interested, you can like look at the slides. But I thought that was interesting because it's not really in big tech's interest to kind of say like, oh, like AI also has bias, right? But like that's where like the catch comes in, because by kind of saying like, oh, like AI has this thing called bias and like we're going to hold ourselves responsible by acknowledging it and like solving bias, it kind of like makes big tech look really good and basically be like, oh, like there's this like new phenomenon of bias that we're going to go in and solve. And I guess like I'm kind of going to discuss like why that narrative and like that kind of discourse is really problematic. This is just a visual from the Medium article that you can just like take a look at for a couple seconds, but it's kind of just summarizing, and the title of the article is The Seductive Diversion of AI Bias, which you'll kind of like understand in a couple minutes. But it's just kind of talking about how a lot of like the inequalities that we see like in our society is like reinforced into AI, and then AI is in turn being used to like make decisions about our society, and it just like becomes a cycle. Okay, so I think that a lot of the issues with like why like big tech saying like, oh, like there's this like phenomenon of like bias and like it's like this new like topic that we can talk about in AI. The way that this is like brought up in itself, I think is very like not good, because it basically kind of makes it seem like bias is like this new thing, when the reality is that anyone who like made the technology of like data science and like is like using data to like build technologies, we would have already predicted that there is bias. Because the way that this works, right, is so we start off with data which comes from observations of an unequal society. I think the top part got cut off, but basically we get data and it's collected through society, which is like inherently unequal, which I think like everyone can agree on. And then we use that data to then quote objectively represent society and make decisions about society that's going to affect everyone's lives. And then we also use it to make tools that dictate how society runs, like AI. Like we all know that's like transforming the world now. The only fact that like we needed to know in order for predicting all of this would happen is the fact that society is unequal, which is like inherently true. So I think like this idea of like basically the point here is that it's like we need to like realize that the way that this idea of like bias in AI is being marketed is really problematic, because it makes it seem like we've rediscovered like this problem within AI, when the reality is like the problem was like already there to begin with, and it's like it's not very like much of a new phenomenon. So that's kind of why the title of the article is called like this seductive diversion, because it basically like diverts the conversation, because it kind of makes us like already inherently accept the fact that like AI is going to exist anyway. It's kind of like we're submitting to the fact like it's inevitable that like AI will like take over society. So now I guess we'll solve the problems within AI. When the reality is like that prevents us from questioning like should there even be AI in the first place, and like should these technologies even exist in the first place? And like that's kind of what this quote from the article summarizes, which is the end game is always to fix AI systems, never to use a different system or no system altogether. So that's like something to think about. And I think like that's something that's like I feel like is really applicable to technology as a whole, but like also like other systems and like other systemic problems, right? Like we always talk about like smaller issues within the system rather than like why are we trying to like fix like the system and like make it better when like the system shouldn't exist in the first place. Yeah, and this is something actually I'll talk about a little bit later more, but yeah, actually I'll come back to this. Okay, the next concept I kind of wanted to touch on was algorithmic fairness, which is very similar to like the article that was about like bias in AI. And I think like it has like similar kinds of like undertones and like kind of ideas of how we're kind of weaponizing the idea of objectivity. So this diagram again is also from the article, which is linked, and it's basically kind of showing how like fundamental data is to our society, and like how like quite literally our society is like a datafied world now, and how all of these different sectors, like your data is traveling from like all these different places, and like how you as an individual and like decisions are being made about you, policies are being made about you, like the federal government, like in the Census Bureau is like taking that data and then like deciding like what programs to make and like who to reach. Like all that data is being transferred to all these different places. So that's why like data is so important, and like it literally like represents who you are in like this like broader population, because obviously like the government and like institutions are not going to you and asking you about your opinion and like your needs, but they're making those decisions based on the data. So the core issue, So the core issue with like kind of this idea of fairness, like, or like trying to solve that with fairness, I think in general, is that we use unfairness to define fairness. So a lot of what this article talks about is how like right now, like there's a lot of like corporate sponsored like research, like of them trying to like create this concept of fairness and trying to almost like computationalize it and like create algorithms that determine like is this fair, is this unfair, and we can already like with the sound, like the way that sounds, like we can already kind of see like how that's problematic, and like how like trying to like make like a mathematic model or something of like what's fair and what's not fair is really like not going to like capture the complexities of like this social problem of like what fairness is, and specifically it like leads to this cycle, which is very similar to like what I described previously about how like data is reinforcing inequalities, because first we take unfairness like as a concept, which basically comes from society, because you collect data on our society, which is like already unequal, right? Like there's people at different playing fields, and then we're taking that data and we're branding it as objective. And I think this is the single most like dangerous thing about like technology and like data as a whole, is the ability to like seem like you're neutral and like seem like you're objective, and then go and use that to do whatever you want. Like it's unquestionable, like no one questions it because the computer generated it, so like it must be objective. And then we go and call this fairness, which is like really dangerous in itself, because now you can see that the unfairness that like was taken in the like the data collected from the unfair society is then goes on to like be used to determine what's fair or not. So like that's already like doesn't make sense in itself. And then we're going and imposing like these technologies and algorithms onto society and like using that to make decisions about everyone's lives. And the cycle will be reinforced, because now that you're using like technology and like algorithms that are have basically like the unfairness integrated into them, and then you're using that to like implement it into society and change society, that means that you're reinforcing like the inequality that you started with. And it also means that it normalizes it, right? Like it comes to the point where someone like might be like someone like it might seem so normal and like so reinforced that someone may never even question it ever, because they're like, oh, like I'm so used to seeing this everywhere, so it must just be normal. And it becomes so ingrained and so internalized like into people. So yeah, this line kind of summarizes what I'm saying. It traps us into this omnipotent objectivity that supposedly cannot be questioned. So we have to question it, because otherwise you're going to like keep feeding into this cycle. Okay, So now I wanted to explain something, maybe hopefully that's more of like a application of like everything that I've been saying, which I honestly thought was mind-blowing, and I hope it's insightful to everyone as well. So we all know that a lot of like the racism that we talk about, especially like in present day, is very it's very revolving around like the criminal justice system, a lot around like police brutality, etc. And I think like we always like might wonder like where did the stereotype come from, right? Like where did the stereotype of like Blackness being associated with criminality come from? And the answer is that it actually came with like one of the first applications, or like more like first like public applications of social science statistics. So that was like honestly pretty like scary to me to realize that like this actually came like from like a kind of like data science / like statistics application. Okay. So just to give a little bit of background, basically, there's a whole like reading on this, and like I could share it with you if you're interested. But basically, there are experts. This was like back in like the late, like in 1890s. Around there were experts like W.E. Du Bois, who, in case you don't know, like basically created sociology, and Ida B. Wells, and they tried to deracialize the concept of criminalization because they started to realize that like in like discourse and like public discourse, people were talking about like race and like talking about Black people through this lens of like criminality and stuff increasingly. So they realized like, oh, like this is starting to become a stereotype that we need to like deracialize. So when they realized that this concept of like criminalization, or this concept of criminalization is very tied to like race, then they were like, okay, the solution is to have a colorblind approach to criminal justice, which seems like the like obvious solution, I think. So that's what their proposal was. But later you'll find out how that was actually like weaponized, like this idea of being colorblind. So, and like also to give further context, I think like as to why like during that time Blackness started to become so tied to like criminalities, because like if you think about like during like post like emancipation, during like post Reconstruction, kind of like of all of these really terrible things that Black people were experiencing, in case you don't know the history, it's like they weren't like allowed to properly vote, like they were being lynched a lot, they were being like assaulted on the street, like horrible kinds of things. And specifically like whenever they tried to do like a simple thing, like even walk on the street or something, or like look someone the wrong way, like the police would go and arrest them or beat them up or something. So you can kind of see like how really quickly like they would start to be associated as criminals. So that's kind of what was happening. But then the next thing that happened was the 1890 census. And during the 1890 census, this is when they first launched this national discussion about Black people as a distinctly criminal population. And the reason why is because that was when it was first available to the public, that like, oh, like only like 12% of our population is African American, but 33% of the people who are incarcerated are African American. So like, why is there such a big gap? And the reason why like people particularly paid attention to this is because like this was a time like post-emancipation, people were trying to understand like what is the like place of Black people in society, what is their role in society, like a white person might be thinking like, like are they really equal to me, like what exactly is their role in this hierarchy. So like this census was very much anticipated because people wanted to understand like Black identity and like where they really belong in America. So and basically what happened in the 1890 census is that like that kind of like reinforced like this idea of like, oh, like Black people are criminals because they, you know, like they seem to be like disproportionately incarcerated. And I think like another thing to, before I even get to like the main point, is that like the third point in itself is that the census, like we realized like the way that people were looking to it as a way to understand Black identity shows like how data, and like specifically the census, is so responsible for forging statistical and racial identities. Like the way you are represented as a person like in America, like for most of like government policies and like most of these initiatives and programs they're carrying out is through the census. So that's why like data is like so important. Okay, am I running out of time?
Yeah, but we can continue.
Okay. So
unless everyone is willing to talk a little more after, like to past 9:30, since we have a book of book pens. I mean, we're not gonna go until 10, but this is an interesting topic because data scientists like even classifying race and ethnicity and all these different stuff is a racial project because.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was like, I should have time.
It's really interesting.
But anyway, so basically what happened is that after the census data was released, what white social scientists did is that they weaponized data's objectivity. So they perpetuated this narrative. Basically, they were like, data is always objective because it's numbers and numbers never lie. And then they said the data that is the situation the data is describing is incarceration. So I guess like incarceration must also be objective because like those two are associated with each other, which already like you can see doesn't make any sense, but that's the narrative they pushed. And then finally, the conclusion is that means like incarceration must be objective. So even after an objective lens, Black people just happen to be arrested more. So I guess Black people are more likely to be criminals. So I guess crime must be a Black thing. So this is a narrative that was pushed by white social scientists like very aggressively, and that's kind of what helped give birth to like this thing of like Black people being criminals, which is pretty like extremely dehumanizing, obviously, because that's what we see like all of those like repercussions even now. Yeah, I guess I'll skim through this more, but basically like this is just going on to show how like white European immigrants weren't treated as much and they were kind of like given a leeway. But I guess like to emphasize the fourth point, which is how the beginnings of social science statistics were rooted in solidifying white supremacy. So we can see like how this is literally like created this like one, I would say like the single most like deadly like stereotype that I feel like defines a lot of the racism that we see now. So that's to show why your role as a data scientist is so like impactful and you have to take it with responsibility. So I guess like one of the big takeaways from today, I hope like everyone takes away is that like, and I think I feel like this has been touched upon a little bit, but so like I want people to see like data science as or like social good not as like a subcategory or like a side like niche thing that people can go into from data science like in like if you're interested in it, it's like inherent to data science in itself. It's at the center of data science because like you're literally like using data, like handling people's lives in your hands and like making products and making decisions that will go and affect them and how like society will look like in the future. And that's why like it's very inherent to data science and you have to like approach it that way rather than like an optional thing to like explore if you're interested in it. And yeah, this is just a further thing, like in case like the entire presentation like wasn't enough to convince you of like why you should care, like here's more reasons why you should care, right? First is like these like the constructs and like the stereotypes and ideas that are being perpetuated by data affect you as a person. So do you really want to like live in a world where you continue internalizing your own oppression, right? Like I don't want to, and I think most people don't want to either. And it's a lot more fulfilling to be authentically yourself. And I think that's directly tied to data science because like the stereotypes and like everything that's being perpetuated by this is literally like manifesting itself like in society. And the same with societal liberation, I think like you would want the same thing for other people. And like if everyone is liberated, like you also feel like more inclined to like authentically live as yourself and like not like within stereotypes. Yeah, and then this is the final slide. Like you have a large impact as a data scientist. We have a lot of privilege being here at Berkeley. And I think the big thing I want to emphasize here is that I think like having the privilege to choose whether or not you like I feel like a lot of us could just go off and like work for like a high paying job but like never care about any of these problems because you have that privilege. But like, you also have the option not to. And I think having that privilege in itself is like having that option itself is a privilege because some people have to just go get a high paying job, even if it means like they're contributing to like unethical practices. But you have that, like a lot of people here have the option not to. So even though it's hard to like try to change the system while still contributing to it in some ways, like Sonia touched upon, it's the extent to which you do that is like entirely in your hands. All right.
Thank you.
Oh shoot. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, then you wanna like talk about like discuss anything about this topic?
Yeah.
I see.
Yes.
Oh, you
can go.
thank you. Okay, so I think one of the main points they talked about the creator was the notion of effective index. And something that I have thought about is if there's any way to sort of like, well, is it possible to remove that whole narrative aspect from data science? Because a lot of what we're doing as a scientist is telling stories, right? For example, in this case, within constellation story, we look at some data and you choose to interpret that in a certain sort of way.
Yeah.
And make it that way. So I guess there are two questions. A, is independence of a narrative from the hard numbers possible? If so, if not, then how do you achieve that?
Wait, independence between what? Sorry.
Between like the narrative aspect of data and sort of like
the what aspect?
So he's asking, can you achieve true objectivity in a way that, like,
exactly.
right?
So,
Because if you get out of narrative, then it's an objectivity.
yeah, let me try to rephrase that. So I guess to what extent do you see the narrative aspect of data shaping discourse versus just, the numbers or like the statistical things of like, oh shit, like racism has increased by like 50%.
By narrative aspect, do you mean like the biases we come in like when we're analyzing data?
Sure. So just the way that, for example, if there's a Medium article, the words that you use to accommodate graphs.
Okay, I'm not fully sure I understand your question, but I think that if I'm getting like I think like in a response to what I did understand is like I think like it's very much like the thoughts and like the narrative and like the intention that you come into the room if you're like working on a data science project, like 100% is like affecting what you do. Like the two different people that are dealing with the same data is not gonna like, or like obviously there's like situations where maybe data is like not as significant, so like it wouldn't really matter what biases you had, but I think it very much like does influence it because like we saw like with the census data, the white social scientists already came in with the narrative that they wanted to promote, which is like Black people are inferior because they lived in a time where like their position in society was being challenged. So, and I think the same way, like we're humans building like these machines. So like whatever inequalities you have, like it's being into like plugged into like that machine as well. So I think that's why like trying to unlearn that as much as possible, which like takes years, but I think like actually doing that is like going to help. It like is very much going to like impact that because like I said, like you're directly like influencing society. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, but I'd also sort of like something outside of that. Yeah, because that's what I've been reading up. I don't know what field, like familiar with Joy Rodrigo. She's like a computer scientist at like MIT, I believe, and she does a lot of research in like algorithmic bias because she's Black and, for example, the way that she made it was that some of those she's like looking at like these facial recognition algorithms, but then they recognize her face first because she's Black. And does that only been trained in like white people.
Oh, there's a Netflix documentary that she made.
So really like that whole something. I'm not sure. I haven't seen it on Berkeley. Simon, what's it on?
Yes.
4AC.
I'm in 4AC, but I will take. Is it be? It's still being. Yeah.
Yeah. 104. You can pick.
Yeah, I think you have to. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I think this like kind of naturally falls under like the big point we made, but I guess like something more I was like, in addition to like data itself representing human bias, and then we have this like culture of objectivity around data. There's also so much room for bias to enter in like the actual like data science process, like in the modeling or engineering or analysis process, like the way we like with in feature engineering or in like model building, anything like there's a lot of assumptions where like the actual like data scientists or coders like bias to just like jump through and like enter like whatever like decision or whatever model being built and whatever like predictions or insights are made. So just want to add that as well. Like it's not just the training the words or like the data that
for sure.
It's also like the people involved. So since we are doing this kind of work, to be extra conscious, like
I think you have. Do you have?
I'm still formulating my question, but the brief question would be like, what's the ideal, I guess, like way we want to look at data through this, right? So like, I think extracting a lot of information from data and getting facts out of it is totally valid. But then it's the scary part of AI letting it use that to make the decision making society of us making assumptions from that to make the decision making like is the scary part. So like just from your presentation, like what's like the ideal process of kind of like engaging with the us and like how do we want to do that?
Okay, I think I feel like you're asking for a solution, Loki, but like but I can give you my ideas. I don't have all the solutions either because I'm still like figuring out like the world. But I would say like I think honestly the root solution is like you have to like you yourself have to like unlearn biases, and I think that takes a lot of like time and a lot of like commitment. But I think like in my opinion, like that's what I think true activism is, and I think that's why like frankly like that's why a lot of people aren't really committed to activism, because so much of it is like a mental thing of like, for example, like let me just give you an example. I think a lot of women can relate to this, but to move through like the workplace, to move through like any environment, like you internalize this idea of like, for example, like if I'm assertive and if I speak out loudly, like I'm gonna be seen as a bitch, right? Like I think everyone or like a lot of women have like dealt with, at least I have. So like, but then like if me internalizing that like over time like prevents me from like, or like me internalizing that over time is like how I got like succeeded through society. But then like let's say I'm a data scientist and like now I go write some like algorithm or something, then me like not realizing I've internalized that will cause me to like write that down or like put that into the code, I guess. So I guess my like answer is that like you have to work on like unlearning like your own like the way like oppression like is internalized in yourself, which takes years and years and years, but I think it's worth it because like I feel like I've started that process and like it liberates you. And I think like once you take that and like go and put that into your data, like that's how from like the ground level like we start to like make it so that there isn't as much bias.
Yeah. Not only about the mental thing, I think just data itself, data collection is really important. So if you're collecting data through like different surveys, and you want to make sure that a lot of different people have looked at the survey questions, because those survey questions coming from your biases may be making other people answer in a biased way. So like just data collection itself, like every process that we do as a data scientist includes bias, and that's why, like Omar said, you have to be extra conscious about what you're doing. And I think Pujitha was so like positive about the world and like amazing. It's really hard to do as a sociology major to be positive about the world. And I think that's amazing. Yeah.